First story, the night shift. The thing about working the night shift in a small-town hospital is that you get used to the quiet. The halls, usually bustling with patients and staff during the day, fall eerily silent after midnight. It becomes routine, an endless stretch of empty rooms, flickering fluorescent lights, and the occasional hum of machines. Most nights, it's peaceful, but there's something about the quiet that gets to you after a while, like the building is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It was a Tuesday, just after 1 a.m., when I first heard the noise. I had been working as a night shift nurse at Belltown General Hospital for about 6 months, and nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened. It was the kind of place where you spent more time checking your phone than checking on patients. But that night, there was something different. A low, muffled sound coming from the far end of the hall. I paused, trying to pinpoint the source. It wasn't coming from any of the patient rooms. They were all empty except for one, and Mr. Donnelly in room 312 was fast asleep. The sound, though faint, seemed to come from the old wing. The East Wing. No one ever talked about it, but everyone knew. The East Wing had been closed down years ago, officially for renovations that never happened. It was where they used to treat mental health patients decades ago, back when practices were different, darker. It had been sealed off, left to collect dust. But even so, rumors circulated. I'd heard whispers from other nurses about strange sounds, shadowy figures in the windows. I'd always brushed it off as small-town gossip. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling me. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight from the supply room and made my way toward the East Wing. The further I walked down the corridor, the colder it became. The lights above flickered, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. The entrance to the old wing was locked, as it always was, but when I pressed on the door, it creaked open. My heart quickened. I stepped inside, the flashlight beam cutting through the thick air. The smell hit me first, stale and damp, like mold and something older, more unsettling. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the floor tiles were cracked underfoot. I walked deeper, following the faint sound. A soft shuffling, almost like the rustle of fabric. At the end of the long corridor, I saw her. A figure stood in the shadows, barely visible but unmistakably there. She was wearing a nurse's uniform, an old one, the kind they wore decades ago. The cap, the starched white apron, everything. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, just stood there, staring into the dark. I froze. The flashlight flickered. When I pointed it down the hall again, she was gone. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to keep walking. It had to be a trick of the light, a reflection, something logical. That's what I told myself, anyway. But as I neared the end of the hall, I saw something else. A door slightly ajar. A room that, according to every record I'd ever seen, didn't exist. Pushed it open. Inside, the room was small, dimly lit by the light from the hallway. There was a bed, an old metal frame hospital bed, covered in dusty sheets. But what caught my attention was the wall. Photos, dozens of them, yellowed, curling at the edges, pinned haphazardly to the plaster. Patients, doctors, nurses, all from another time. And there, in the middle of the wall, was a photo of her, the woman I had seen. Her name was written on a plaque beneath the photo, Nurse Evelyn Green. I leaned in closer, reading the caption below her photo. It was an old newspaper clipping, dated over 40 years ago. Nurse accused of patient deaths dies under mysterious circumstances. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I had heard whispers about her, Evelyn Green, a nurse who had worked in the mental health ward before it was shut down. There had been rumors that she was responsible for several patients' deaths, though nothing was ever proven. And then, one night, she had simply died, alone, in one of the very rooms she had once worked. The article said she had been found at the end of her shift, her face frozen in terror, with no sign of what had caused her death. I stepped back, my skin prickling with fear. The room suddenly felt too small, too close. I turned to leave, but then I heard it again. That soft shuffling sound. I spun around, and there she was, Nurse Green, standing in the doorway, blocking my exit. Her face was still, her eyes wide and hollow, locked on mine. She took a step forward, and I felt the temperature drop sharply. My breath hitched as my body locked in place, unable to move. Another step, then another. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She reached for me, her fingers pale and cold, and for a brief moment her lips moved. A whisper, barely audible but filled with sorrow. I didn't do it. The lights flickered violently, and suddenly the room plunged into darkness. My flashlight died, and I was left standing in the pitch black. I could feel her presence, the cold seeping into my skin, and I knew she was right in front of me. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and ran, stumbling out of the room, down the hallway, and back into the main hospital. My heart pounded as I slammed the door behind me, my chest heaving with panic. For the rest of my shift, I stayed at the nurse's station, refusing to move. The strange noises stopped. The hospital was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, watching from the shadows. The next day, I asked one of the older nurses about Evelyn Green, careful not to sound too eager. She hesitated before answering. "She used to work here, yes?" the nurse said quietly. "Died under strange circumstances. After that, well, people said they still saw her from time to time. Always at night. Always in that old uniform." I tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't. I knew what I had seen. Now, every night when I start my shift, I can feel it, that cold presence just out of sight. And though I try to ignore it, I know that one day, Nurse Evelyn Green will come for me too, just like she came for them. Second story, the last heartbeat. It was just after 3 a.m., the deadest hour of the night, when the strange pulse started. I had been working the night shift at Westbrook Cardiac Hospital for nearly a year, and I'd grown used to the quiet. The kind of quiet that settled in the halls like a thick fog, broken only by the steady beeping of heart monitors and the occasional shuffling of feet. This was the part of the night where time seemed to drag, where every minute felt like an hour, and the only company you had were the machines. I was stationed in the cardiac ICU, where patients with end-stage heart failure were kept. It wasn't an easy place to work. You were constantly surrounded by the fragile edge of life, watching people come and go, more often go. But the stillness of the night was comforting, predictable, until that night. I was reviewing some patient charts, half awake, when one of the monitors began to beep. At first, it didn't register. The sound was so familiar that I barely glanced up. But something about the rhythm made me pause. It wasn't the usual flat line of a heart finally giving up or the erratic beeps of a heart struggling to hold on. No, this was different, steady, rhythmic, a heartbeat. I checked the monitor, room 305. The problem was the patient in room 305 had died over a week ago. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe there was a malfunction, I thought. Machines misread signals all the time, right? I tried to rationalize it, but my gut was telling me something was off. A cold chill ran down my spine. I decided to check it out. I grabbed my tablet and headed down the long, dimly lit corridor toward room 305. The hallway stretched out ahead of me, the sterile white walls seeming to close in as the beeping from the monitor grew louder, more insistent. When I reached the door, it felt colder than it should have. My hand hesitated on the handle, but I forced myself to push it open. The room was empty, or at least it should have been. The bed was still made, the sheets tucked in tightly, as they had been since the patient passed. But as I stepped inside, I saw it. Standing at the foot of the bed was a man. He was pale, almost translucent in the weak light filtering through the blinds, his back turned to me. His thin hospital gown barely clung to his frail frame, and his shoulders were hunched as if he were in pain. At first, I thought it was a mistake. A patient had wandered into the wrong room, confused. "Sir," my voice was shaky, barely a whisper. "You're not supposed to be in here." The man didn't move. He just stood there, motionless, staring down at the bed. A wave of unease swept over me, my skin prickling with cold sweat. I took a step closer. "Sir." Finally, he turned. The face that greeted me wasn't one of the living. His eyes were sunken, hollow, and his skin had the sickly blue tint of someone who had been dead for days. I recognized him immediately, Mr. Carver, the patient from room 305. I had been on shift the night he passed. I had watched as his heart monitor flatlined, as his chest rose and fell one last time, and then nothing. But now here he was, standing, watching. I stumbled back, heart racing, and reached for the call button on my belt. My fingers fumbled with it, but when I pressed it, nothing happened. The small screen on my tablet glitched and then went black. The lights in the room flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The monitor, still beeping steadily, began to speed up, the sound growing louder, sharper, like an alarm warning me of something I didn't understand. I backed out of the room, breathing hard, my mind racing. None of this made sense. I had to get help. I had to tell someone. But as I turned to run, the hallway had changed. The lights overhead flickered, casting everything in a sickly green hue. The walls, once pristine white, now seemed stained, like years of decay had suddenly set in. Doors that had been closed were now open, and in each one I could see figures. Pale, shadowy figures, standing at the foot of empty beds, just like Mr. Carver. Silent, watching. The hospital felt wrong, like it wasn't just a place for the living anymore. Like something had shifted, letting in something darker. The cold air pressed in on me, and I could feel them closing in. I tried to scream, but my throat tightened. The air felt heavy, thick, as though I was breathing in dust. I could hear the monitors from each room now, all beeping in unison, a chorus of heartbeats that shouldn't exist. I forced myself to move, stumbling down the hall, my only thought to get to the nurse's station and call for help. But when I got there, the station was empty. The lights on the monitors were out, the computers dead. I frantically grabbed the landline phone, but there was no dial tone, just static. Behind me, I heard footsteps, slow, heavy. I turned, and there she was, a nurse, but not one I recognized. Her uniform was from another time, stained and torn. Her face was gaunt, her eyes milky and void of life. She stood there, watching me the way Mr. Carver had. Suddenly, I understood. This wasn't just about one patient. It was the hospital itself. Something here didn't let go. The patients, the staff, they never truly left. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. The nurse took a step toward me, her head tilting to one side in a grotesque, unnatural movement. Behind her, more figures began to gather. Patients, doctors, nurses, all of them dead, all of them slowly closing in. The beeping grew louder, faster, like a final warning. I ran. I don't know how I made it out of that hallway, how I found myself in the lobby, gasping for air under the harsh fluorescent lights. But when I looked back, the doors to the ICU were closed. Silent. The monitors no longer beeped. The strange cold gone. The next day, I requested a transfer. I told my supervisor it was stress, that I needed a break. I didn't tell her what I saw. Who would believe me? But every night since then, I dream of the hospital, of those hollow eyes, and I can still hear the sound that haunts me most of all. The steady, rhythmic heartbeat, the last heartbeat of the dead. Third story, patient 0. I've worked in the infectious diseases unit at St. Vincent's Hospital in New York for nearly a decade. I thought I had seen it all: Ebola scares, flesh-eating bacteria, even cases that required full quarantine procedures. But nothing could have prepared me for what walked through our doors that night. The call came in at around 2 a.m. A critically ill patient was being transferred to our unit, diagnosed with something they couldn't classify. Some kind of virus. The doctors sounded nervous, and that wasn't common. There was an edge in their voices as they spoke, a tension that set off alarms in my head. His name was David Carson, but in the days that followed, he would only be referred to as Patient Zero. When they wheeled him in, I could barely look at him. His skin was pale and mottled, covered in strange, dark lesions that seemed to spread by the minute. He was feverish, drenched in sweat, his breathing ragged and erratic. His eyes, though they were the worst part, bloodshot and wild, darting around the room like he was searching for something, or someone. The quarantine protocols were extreme. No one could enter the room without full protective gear. But even with the layers of plastic and fabric between me and him, I felt exposed, vulnerable. That first night, things seemed normal enough, or at least as normal as they could be in a situation like that. I monitored his vitals, administered medication through 4, and checked the charts. But something was off. The machines would glitch intermittently, the lights in his room flickering for no reason. At first, I thought it was just the old building showing its age. It wasn't. On my second night shift, it started to get worse. Every time I entered Patient Zero's room, I felt a heaviness in the air, like the oxygen was being sucked out. The shadows around his bed seemed to stretch longer than they should have, twisting unnaturally. I caught myself staring at them, convinced they were moving, shifting on their own. When I turned away, I could swear I saw something out of the corner of my eye, something standing just beyond the reach of the fluorescent lights. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Dr. Collins, who had been overseeing the case, started complaining about headaches every time he was near the room. 2 of the nurses flat out refused to enter after the 3rd night. One of them, Rachel, a tough-as-nails woman who had been working at St. Vincent's longer than me, told me she heard voices, whispers, when she was in there. "They're watching us," she said one night, her eyes wide and glassy. "There's something in the room with him, Amanda, and it's not human." I laughed it off, or at least pretended to. But inside, I knew something was wrong. People started disappearing. First, it was minor. A nurse wouldn't show up for a shift. Then a janitor who was assigned to clean the floor near Patient Zero's room. No one seemed to be able to track them down. The hospital administration dismissed it as a coincidence, but I could feel it creeping under my skin. It was all connected to him, to David Carson. The final straw came on my 5th night. The ward was unusually quiet, almost eerily so. There were only a few of us working the night shift, and I was alone in the nurse's station when I noticed something odd on the security feed. Patient Zero's room was empty. His bed was there, the monitors beeping away, but he was gone. My stomach dropped. I blinked and leaned in closer to the screen, hoping my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, the bed was completely empty. I ran down the hall, my heart pounding. When I burst into the room, the smell hit me first. It was metallic like blood, but thicker. The room was freezing cold, far colder than it should have been. I could see my breath hanging in the air. The shadows seemed to cling to the walls, darker than before, pulsing. And then I saw him, Patient Zero, standing in the corner, his back to me. His hospital gown was soaked with sweat and blood, and the lesions had spread all over his body. But he was moving, his body twitching, like he was being pulled by invisible strings. "Amanda!" His voice was barely a whisper, like something was scraping against his vocal cords. I froze, too afraid to move, my mind screaming for me to run, but my legs betraying me. He slowly turned his head, just enough so I could see his face. I wish I hadn't. His eyes were no longer human. They were empty, black pits, swirling with something dark, something alive. His mouth curled into a twisted smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "The hospital," he rasped. "They knew." Knew what? My mind raced, but I couldn't form words. My throat was tight, my lungs burning as though I couldn't breathe. I stumbled back, crashing into the door as the lights flickered overhead. Suddenly, his body convulsed violently, collapsing onto the floor. I rushed forward, every instinct as a nurse kicking in. But as soon as I touched him, I felt it. A coldness that wasn't just from the room, but something deeper. It radiated from his skin, crawling up my arm like ice in my veins. And then the shadows around us moved. They weren't just shadows. They were things, twisted, malformed shapes that circled the bed like vultures, writhing and whispering in a language I couldn't understand. They pulled at him, sinking into his skin, as if they were feeding off him, growing stronger as he grew weaker. I staggered back, horrified. This wasn't a disease. This was something else entirely. Something the hospital had kept hidden. Something they had let in. I fled the room, slamming the door behind me. My pulse was racing, my skin drenched in cold sweat. I couldn't get the image of his eyes, those dark, empty voids, out of my mind. I went straight to the hospital archives that night, desperate for answers. I sifted through file after file until I found it. An old report buried beneath layers of bureaucratic nonsense. Patient Zero wasn't the first. There had been others. Over the years, sporadically, the hospital had received patients with similar symptoms: strange lesions, delirium, and inexplicable deaths. Each time, the staff involved had either quit or disappeared. The files were labeled as highly classified, all under the directive of Dr. Collins. I confronted him the next morning. He didn't deny it. "It's not a disease, Amanda," he said, his voice calm, as if he'd long come to terms with it. "Something older, something that feeds, and we let it in." I left the hospital that day and never looked back. But even now, I still feel it, like something's watching me, waiting. It's only a matter of time before it finds its next host, before it finds me. Fourth story, the silence of the fifth floor. I had been a nurse at St. Augustine Psychiatric Hospital for over 5 years, and in that time I had worked nearly every floor, every wing. But not the fifth floor. No one worked the fifth floor unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't because the patients were particularly dangerous. No, the danger was quieter than that. Subtle. When my supervisor asked me to cover a shift up there, I hesitated. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I didn't want to seem superstitious. The other nurses had told stories, of course, rumors about that floor, passed around like ghost tales in the break room. But I never put much stock in them. They said the fifth floor was where St. Augustine's most difficult patients were kept under rigorous observation, but no one ever explained what that meant. All I knew was people who worked there didn't stay long. Still, I accepted the assignment. It was just one shift. I could handle it. When I arrived that evening, the first thing I noticed was how different it felt. The hospital was old, with the usual creaks and groans that came with age. But on the fifth floor, it was unnaturally still. The air was thick, stagnant, like the building itself was holding its breath. The nurses before me were eager to leave, barely making eye contact as they handed off their notes. "It's quiet tonight," one of them said, her voice hollow. She didn't explain further, just gathered her things and practically bolted for the elevator. I was alone. The patients were all in their rooms, locked behind heavy metal doors with small, barred windows. There were 12 of them in total, each under constant surveillance due to their unpredictable conditions. But what struck me immediately was the silence. In any other wing, the halls would be filled with sounds, murmurs, pacing footsteps, sometimes screams or sobs. But here there was nothing. The entire ward was silent. I walked the length of the hallway, peering into each room as I made my rounds. The patients were sitting or lying in their beds, staring blankly at the walls, their mouths shut tight. They didn't acknowledge me, didn't move. They just sat there, as though they were waiting for something. It was unsettling, to say the least. As the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the way the patients seemed too still. like they were listening for something that I couldn't hear. I sat at the nurse's station, flipping through old records, trying to make sense of the unease gnawing at me. That's when I found it. Buried in the back of a dusty drawer, I came across a file that looked much older than the others. The paper was yellowed, the edges brittle. It detailed an experimental treatment that had been conducted on the 5th floor decades ago, something called the silence therapy. According to the notes, it was designed to suppress violent tendencies in patients by inducing a state of extreme sensory deprivation. The treatment involved isolation, total silence, and repeated exposure to low-frequency sounds that were supposed to calm the mind. But it had gone horribly wrong. The file mentioned a string of deaths, patients who had stopped responding, their vital signs plummeting after weeks of treatment. What was strange, though, was that none of these deaths had been officially recorded in the hospital system. It was as if they had been erased, forgotten. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The experiment had been shut down, but it seemed like something had been left behind. As I sat there, lost in thought, I heard it for the first time. A whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. It came from down the hall, a faint murmur, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest, and followed the sound. It led me past the patients' rooms, all still as statues, until I reached the end of the hallway. Room 512. The door was closed, but I could hear the whispering more clearly now. I pressed my ear against the cold metal, trying to make out the words. But they weren't words, not in any language I could recognize. It was a jumble of sounds, a low, droning murmur that seemed to twist and curl around itself, sinking into my bones. I turned the handle, expecting resistance, but the door swung open with ease. The room was empty, no patient, no bed, just a bare, sterile room with white walls and a single overhead light flickering weakly. The whispering stopped the moment I stepped inside. The silence that followed was suffocating. And then I saw them, shadows. They moved along the walls, slithering like liquid smoke. They didn't have form or shape, just a mass of darkness that pulsed and shifted. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but the shadows didn't disappear. They seemed to watch me, circling the room as if waiting for me to make a move. I backed out slowly, my heart racing, and slammed the door shut. But the whispering started again, louder this time, echoing down the hall. It wasn't just room 512 anymore, it was coming from everywhere. Every door, every corner of the floor. The patients, who had been silent for hours, were now moving in their rooms, pacing, their eyes darting to the windows, as if they, too, could hear the whispers. I ran back to the nurse's station, frantic, flipping through the old records again. There had to be something, anything, to explain what was happening. That's when I saw it. A final note scrawled in the margins of the last page of the file. The treatment didn't silence them. It just made them harder to hear. The lights flickered violently then, plunging the entire floor into darkness. The whispering grew deafening, a chorus of voices rising in pitch, and I could feel the walls closing in. The patient's doors rattled, as if something or someone was trying to get out. I grabbed my things and bolted for the elevator. My hands shook as I jabbed the button repeatedly, the whispers now right behind me, crawling up my spine. The doors slid open just as a cold gust of air rushed down the hall, and I stumbled inside, slamming the close button as hard as I could. As the elevator descended, I heard one last thing before the doors sealed shut. A voice, clear as day, whispering right into my ear. "We never left. I haven't set foot on the 5th floor since. No one talks about it. But every now and then, late at night, I hear rumors. Nurses say they hear whispers coming from the vents, or shadows moving in places they shouldn't. And sometimes they say patients still disappear up there.